it's Dana from MadeEveryday.com, and today we are going to make a 9-patch quilt block, 2 different ways, and then we're going to make an entire 9-patch quilt, which is so much fun. We will walk through all of the steps together. So let's do it. If you don't know what a 9-patch is, well, that is what we're gonna make. You came to the right spot. And if this is your first time making a quilt, or if you're teaching someone to make a quilt for the first time, awesome. This is a great beginner project. I do recommend, however, that you first check out my ultimate quilt video, which goes through every step in really fine detail. I'll still go through all the steps with you in this video, but that one just has a little bit additional information and tips and tricks. This is a really simple way to try out a 9-patch without feeling overwhelmed by all the details. Just pick out 9 fabrics, which is the really fun part, I think, and cut them into little squares, which I have done here with my cutting mat and my rotary cutter and my ruler. So for this size of a block, we are gonna cut each of our patches 2.5 by 2.5 inches. So like that. And I'll turn this way, and 2.5 inches going this way. You would do that for all 9 of your fabrics. So I'm gonna go to my machine, take my first square, put the next square on it with right sides together, sew down the side with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. That just means slightly over from where a 1/4 inch seam is. Press that seam to the side or open. I like to press to the side. Then take my next square, place that on top with right sides together, and sew that again with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and press that seam to the opposite side. Now I've got my first row. Do the same thing with your second row and with your third row. Then take your first row and second row, put them right sides together, sew with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, press that seam to the side, and do the same thing with your third row. And when you're done, you've got your finished little block. Now we want to square it up, which means to make sure all the sides are straight. And this is a really important step because this is where your wiggle room is, where you can fix any inconsistencies you may have had with sewing or cutting in previous steps, so that when you then start putting larger quilt blocks together to make your quilt, well, everything is straight and consistent and looks awesome. So trim down your block to 6.5 by 6.5 inches. And there you go, one finished 9-patch block, which you could then add with more blocks that look the same, or throw in some blocks that are different and start making your little quilt design come in together. Now, this was the most basic way to sew a 9-patch. Now I'm gonna show you a more efficient way and my favorite method. If you're making a large quilt, this method is ideal because you can make many quilt blocks at once. We don't have to cut all those little squares. Instead, we're going to cut strips of fabric that will then come together in this cool checkerboard effect. And you can make your quilt any size, dimensions that you want. If you look in the video description, I will leave all the information for this particular size. We are going to make a throw size quilt, which will be 60 by 72 inches, which I think is ideal for putting on a couch or a chair at the end of a bed. And the finished size quilt block will be 6 inches, which means we're going to cut our strips 2.5 inches. So we just need to make 120 of these guys. Don't freak out. Okay, we are ready to cut our fabric. Actually, you are always asking me, should I pre-wash and dry my fabric? Great question. It's kind of personal preference. I would say most traditional quilters do not pre-wash their fabric because it's just easier to cut it when it's fresh off the bolt. And then you want to think about the finished product. Your quilt, when you wash it for the first time, is going to shrink up with all those different layers, the quilt front, the batting, the backing, and give you kind of this cool crinkly effect. So that's my answer. Now we're ready to cut our fabric. We need a 1/4 yard each of 2 different fabrics. Or you could use 2 fat quarters of fabric, which if you're not familiar with, a fat quarter is the same amount of fabric as a 1/4 of a yard. It's just cut a little bit differently. So as you can see, if I put those together, this 1/4 yard is cut selvage to selvage, so it's super long, but that's actually the same square footage if I was to move this over here. So the fat quarter is 18 by 22, and the 1/4 yard is 9 by 44 inches. And from these 2 fabrics, we can get 10 9-patch squares. Woo! So we are gonna take our fabric and we are gonna cut 2.5-inch strips for this particular quilt that we're making. You always wanna start, mine looks pretty clean here, but if not, I would put this here and cut a really clean edge. My fabric right now is folded into 4ths like that. I just find that it's easier to cut my strips that way. For this project, I am going to use my ruler. Because my ruler is 3 inches wide, I can use that instead of using the markings on my mat. Both should be accurate, but someone mentioned to me that your ruler is maybe more accurate, so I'm gonna go with that right now. So, there we go, and I should be able to get 3 strips out of my 1/4 yard, which we are then going to subcut in half. I'm just going to cut those right there along that fold so that when I'm done, I actually end up with 6 strips. Then for this one, if you had the fat 1/4, you would cut this into 6 strips. So that's still a pretty nice clean edge. I'm gonna go with that. And I am going to, again, cut 2.5 inches wide and just cut my 6 strips. I have all my strips here, 6 of each. And if you would cut yours from the 1/4 yards of fabric, you wouldn't need to subcut like I did. You could have just left them as 3 long strips. That would be fine too. I just like this method because you might have a 1/4 yard mixed with the fat 1/4, or you might want to mix and match other fabrics, and it just gives you a few more options. So we are going to start by assembling these together. I'm going to take 4 of each strip, and we're going to keep the other leftover 4 strips for after we sew these, and we're just going to put it right sides together. You could just go to your machine and sew this straight down. I actually do like to pin in this step. I find that it helps so that my fabric doesn't slip a little from the edge as I'm going. So, you know, you get to decide what kind of quilter you are. I'm going to do that for all 4 of our strips, strip pairs, I guess, and then we will go to our sewing machine. I'm sewing on my Baby Lock Brilliant machine, which you have seen before, but I added some fun little decals to it, which I love. It's so cute. I'm sewing with my 1/4 inch presser foot on, and what that means is that I am going to get a 1/4 inch seam allowance from my needle to the edge of this presser foot. And if you're ever unsure, you could drop your needle down, put your presser foot down, and I can see that that distance is exactly a 1/4 inch. Now, what is important with this project is that we want to sew with a scant 1/4 inch. So what I like to do, I like to adjust my needle position over just a little bit, and that makes it so I can get a scant 1/4 inch. I'm gonna bring over my first strip, and I can now sew to the edge of this presser foot and still get my scant 1/4 inch. And what that scant 1/4 inch does is it gives you just a little bit of wiggle room at the end so that we can trim down our block, which is, again, really important. Like I said, quilting is all about being precise. Then just do the same thing for all 4 of your strips. Now let's press out our seams. And what I love with this block is that if we press properly each time, all these little seams nest together and just look so beautiful. So with our fabric, we need to designate one side as the dark side and one side as the light side. This is definitely the darker one. But if you have a block that it's not super obvious, you just need to pick one so that you're consistent with how you press each time. I like to lay my strip down with the dark side facing up. And this is just having done this many times. This is my method that I like. First, I'm gonna just press that seam to kind of set the seam. Give it a little steam if you want. And then to take this with my iron, and I'm going to press the seam to the side, to the dark side, like that. I don't want to tug my fabric because I don't want it to stretch, even though this is cut on a straight line. You know, a seam could have a tendency to stretch, so I'm just pushing lightly, giving it some steam. So do this for all 4 of our strips. We have our 4 finished paired strips, and then we have our remaining strips right here. So what we want to do is to attach these, and since there's 2 of each left, you can see how this is going to work. 2 of the sets will look like this, and 2 of the sets will get the dark strip and be opposites, and that is what gives us this cute little checkerboard effect. So just like we did before, you're gonna grab a strip, a paired strip, and add the remaining strip on top, pin it together. Then we're going to go back to our machine. We are going to sew down each of these with our scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then we are going to press out all those seams as well. Again, we want to press to the dark side of the fabric, and what will probably feel natural with this strip is that you want to press like that, but that would be pressing your seam to the light side. If we flipped that over, you can see that both the seams are now going the same direction, which we don't want. We want them to go opposite directions so we get that little nesting effect. So instead of pressing it that way, flip it over so the dark side is going up. Set your seam first like that, and then you can come up underneath and flip that seam over. And if pressing doesn't come, really naturally to you, just keep going with it, keep practicing. I think you'll be really happy with the way it all comes together. With this combo, I do get to easily just press over like that because that is the dark side of the fabric. Now that our strip batches are pressed oh so nicely, we are ready to cut them all up. Take each of your strips and we want to subcut them into 2.5 inch cross sections. So I'm going to start with a nice clean edge because you can see this is a little off right there. So using my ruler, I can line up a horizontal line here of my fabric and cut that off like that. And then I'm going to use my ruler as my guide to cut my 2.5 inch sections. So I'm lining up, this is my 2.5 inch mark right there. And again, making sure things are straight. Cut like that. Then I can go to the next one. And using my ruler as the guide makes it so I don't have to pay attention as much to the lines on the cutting mat. So that makes it just a little bit easier. Whoop! Didn't cut that one through all the way on a little tiny thread. Okay, keep going with all 4 of your strips. I cut one of them too small. Did you see that? And we end up with 8 cross sections from each of our 4 strips. You're going to end up with a few extra of these afterward, but I kind of love that because if you cut something a little wrong or you sewed something a little wrong, you got backup. So that's awesome. Okay, we are going to put together 10 blocks, which we're making. So I'm going to take this section and this section, and I know there's 8 in there, so I'm going to add 2 more. And then these we're just going to put aside for now. Then here's where the really fun part of the little nesting comes together. And you could do this here, you could do this over at your machine. Typically, I will take these over to my machine and put them together there so I can just work quickly. But you're going to take a light one with the dark one, opposites, and place them together. And if we were precise with everything, you can see how those little seams just kind of nest together like that. Nesting meaning that it's not as bulky because this seam's going that way and this seam is going the other way, which is like really awesome. So you could either match up the seams or you could just match up the edges. I kind of like to match up the edges, even though a proper quilter might say that's wrong, but that ensures that my square is a little more precise. So I place 2 pins through those 2 seams and that one's ready to go. Then I do the next one and go from there. I would do all 10 of these and then go to my machine and we are going to chain sew all of them together. Be careful as you're doing this that you're not tugging too much or you might pull apart some of these seams. So just hold them carefully. If something does come apart, you can always go back to your machine and sew that little seam again. Just like our strips, we're going to sew with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to sew right down, and then get to the end here. I'm not going to cut my threads like I usually show you. We are just going to take our next one and put that right underneath, like that, and just keep going with the next one. This is called chain sewing, and it is a very productive way to sew a bunch of similar pieces over and over again. And then this is cool. Some machines have this feature right here where you can just cut your little threads in between each of these chains right here. It's a little blade right there. So then, right now you can see all of these are connected together. But instead of using my scissors, I can just go like this. And that makes it real fast and efficient. Now we need to go press all of our seams. Press out our seams just as we did before, pressing to the dark side. So first set the seam, then flip this over. And that makes it real easy. I'll give it a little bit of steam. Okay, I'm gonna do that for all 10 of these. And if you don't wanna do 10 at a time, you can sew these in smaller batches. I'm just doing 10 because I know I'm making this giant quilt, so why not just go for it and get them done. Remember, not on this side. That would be the light side according to what I have designated. This is the dark side. And they all have a dark side. Don't we all have a dark side? Quilting is really deep, guys. Here are my 10 blocks. They all look identical right now, but we are gonna take those extra strips that we had and now attach these to the blocks. I would do this over at my sewing machine, but I will show you here real quick. Let's take one of these, and I'm going to grab an opposite piece like that, right sides together, nest those little seams together. They just fit so nicely. Look at that. Oh, it really is beautiful when it nests together perfectly. That is a hard word to say, nests. Okay. It's like ghosts. So there's my first one, and then you would keep doing this. Now remember I said you're going to have some extras of these, or in my case, one less since I cut one too short, but you want to make sure that you're varying them. So if you get to this one and in your mind you're like, wait, this doesn't match, just, flip it over. It's okay. No big deal. Done that before. Okay, keep hitting these. Then take all of these over to our sewing machine. Again, sew with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, chain sewing all of these together. Then we want to press out our seams, press into the dark side. Remember, even if it feels a little awkward, flip it over, dark side. Then trim down all of our blocks to 6.5 by 6.5 inches. And when we're done, we should have a stack of 10 quilt blocks, which means from our 2 fat quarters, we got 10 blocks, which means for our entire quilt, we need 24 fat quarters. And we just gotta do this 110 more times. You totally got this. So grab your other fabrics, cut your fabric, sew the strips together, press, trim, and eventually you have 120 blocks. Yay! Now it's time to lay out our quilt. And the cool thing is that this is kind of a random quilt, so you can put your blocks in any order that you want. My husband is a statistician, and he reminds me sometimes that the pattern can be random, meaning the randomness of the order is sometimes an organized part of nature. So, who knew? I guess you and I do know. You can do this on your table or on the floor. I like to start at the table so I can get a general idea of how things are looking, and then I move to the floor so I can lay out the entire thing. Some people also do this on their wall with some felt fabric. When you're done laying it out, take a photo with your phone because you will notice things differently through a photo than with your naked eye. You'll see spots where you should swap out different blocks or the little holes that need to be filled. And then we are ready to start sewing our rows. So grab your first 10 blocks. Pretty straightforward. I'm going to take my first 2 blocks and put these aside. This is the order that I want my entire row to be in. And I'm going to place them with right sides together. I want to check that my seams are going in the same direction. So this one actually should be going vertical. Okay, great. They're both going the same direction now. And since we trimmed everything up, this is going to fit together so nicely. We're not going to square up our rows when we're done. So it's very important that we sew these as precisely as possible. I'm not going to use any pins. I'm just going to go straight to my sewing machine. And I am not sewing with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. I am just using my standard 1/4 inch. And I'm going to be the same consistency with that throughout my quilt. as I sew these rows and blocks together. Okay, cut my threads. Then I'm going to grab my next one right here. Make sure my seams are going the right direction again. Yep, that looks great. And then I'm going to sew this one to the previous one. And then when we're done, we're going to press out these seams. Isn't this looking so fun? I love when the blocks start to come together and it's actually looking like a quilt. Now we are going to press our seams, and contrary to what we did before, we are going to press these seams open. And if that is hurting your quilting brain, you are welcome to press to the side. It is just a personal preference, but I like to press open in this step because with so many seams coming together, I feel like this distributes that bulky area just a little bit better. So it's kind of helps to get your finger in there and do a little bit of a finger press first. Now we're going to flip it over and press the whole thing flat on this side. And I like to start in the middle and just kind of press my way out, giving it a little steam. This part is really satisfying, I find. It makes everything nice and flat and precise and ready to go when we sew all of our rows together. Then keep going through this process for each of your stacks, for each of your rows, and press your seams. And when you're done, we should have 12 rows of 10 blocks each. And look at that. That is a lot of sewing and cutting and trimming. So good job so far. We are now going to sew all of these rows together, and I like to start at the bottom of my quilt and work my way up, which is how I have these stacked. I sewed my first row, laid it down, sewed the next one. We're going to put these together the same way that we sewed the blocks together into the rows. So I would grab those two, and I like to take the bottom one and flip it up to the top one like that. And then after those are sewn, it's easy to grab my next one and place that on top and just keep going that way. So let's go like this. And with these seams that we pressed open, those are kind of some good landmarks for us so that we can see how to put those two seams together right there. Be careful that you're not splitting them apart. So you want to, not be throwing these rows around, because I'm sure that's what you would be doing. And pin those. And even if you got a little off somewhere, try to kind of fudge it and, make it work. It's going to help if you can line things up at these block seams, because that will help you as you're going and adding more rows to it so that you don't get a wonky looking quilt. And then after I pin this, we are going to go back to our machine, sew this down with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then we're going to press our seam open just like we did when we were sewing the blocks into the rows. And then we're just gonna keep sewing each row to each row to each row. Our quilt top is done and pressed and looks so beautiful. And now we get to add our backing and our batting. For the backing, I chose this super soft flannel, which I am so excited about. It's by my friend Sharon Holland, designed for Art Gallery Fabrics, and I just think it's gonna add a really nice, cozy, soft layer to this quilt. And then for my batting, I'm just using a standard cotton, warm, cozy batting for the middle. We want our backing and our batting to be 8 inches larger than our finished quilt top all the way around. That just gives us a little bit of wiggle room when we are doing those quilting lines. Now, because our backing fabric is only about 42 inches wide, that means we have to piece together a few cuts of fabric to get something that large. There's a few ways you could do this. I'm going to cut the same fabric into 2 large pieces, but you could cut it 3 pieces, 4 pieces, whatever fragments you might have around, or you could even use different prints. I've seen that on the back where people put 3 different fabrics together. Lots of fun options. So to figure out how much yardage I need, I always like to draw a quick little picture. I know that my quilt top is 60 by 72 inches. So I'm gonna add 8 inches to that. That means 68 by 80 inches is what I need to cut my backing and my batting. So to figure out how much fabric I need, I'm gonna draw a little picture here. We know that our fabric is pretty standard quilting fabric is about 42 inches, so I'm gonna say 41 inches. And 41 inches again. So I need 68 inches up here, which is a little less than 2 yards. So probably 2 yards and 2 yards. So I need 4 yards of my backing fabric. Now, because this fabric is non-directional with these little flowers, it will be easy for me to cut 2 large pieces and sew it with the seam that is not very noticeable. But if you had a print that was more directional, such as this fun cat fabric from my candy quilt, this is another video here on my channel, you should check it out. You can see where I sewed these 2 large pieces of fabric together right here at this seam. And this is a more directional print, so I had to carefully piece these 2 large pieces together so that the cat faces came together, which look a little better in some cats than others. This guy's a little squished, but you know, in the end, most people won't notice it, but try to pay attention when you have a directional print. Then I'm going to take my fabric, cut my 2 large pieces of fabric, place them right sides together, sew them with a straight line using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I find that that just gives me a little more structure with this seam since it's right in the middle of my quilt. Press my seam to the side or open, and then my backing is ready to go. For the quilt sandwich, use your preferred method. What I like to do is place my backing fabric on the floor with the right side facing down, secure it to the floor using painter's tape so it doesn't wiggle around as we're making the quilt sandwich. Then I place the batting on top of that. I like to use my iron to smooth everything out, make sure there's no little folds or tucks. And then I trim it down to the same size as my backing and then secure that in place as well using tape. Then place the quilt top on top of that, centering it in the middle of the backing and batting. Then secure the 3 layers together. Some people like to use a basting spray for all of these steps, which is also great. I'm gonna use these safety pins. I like the bent ones because they're just a little easier to use. And you wanna place them about a fist's width apart. If you know what type of quilting design you want to do in the next step, you want to consider that as you're placing pins and try not to place pins where you think you're gonna sew. Then we're going to quilt all the layers together. That just means to sew a decorative stitch on top, either by hand or with your machine. It could be straight lines, diagonal lines, decorative lines. I'm using my walking foot for this step, but you could definitely use your standard presser foot. I show that in my other videos. And then when you're done, you want to square up the quilt. That just means to lay it down on the ground or on a table and trim everything down, make sure it's nice and straight. I like to use my floor so that I can use the lines of my tile or wood to really get a straight line. And then we are ready to add our binding. The quilting is all done and I really love how this stitch pattern looks on the front. It makes these squares look like even smaller squares, while on the back, it gives it this larger grid effect. For my binding, I am going to use this that is also in the quilt right here. So, how much binding do we need? Well, grab a piece of paper and a calculator and let's just draw out our quilt like that. We know the dimensions, it's 60 by 72. If I add up those 4 sides, that equals 264 inches. That's how much binding I need to go all the way around my quilt. Let's also draw our fabric here. This is where we're gonna cut our strips for the binding. We know that that's 42 inches wide, so let's divide 264 by our 42, and it's telling me I need 6.28 strips, which let's just round up to 7 strips from our binding fabric. Well, how much fabric is that? Okay, each of our strips is going to be 2.5 inches wide, so take 2.5 times our 7 strips. We need 17.5 inches of binding fabric, which let's round up to 18 inches, which equals a half yard of fabric, which I know probably felt like a lot of math, but I just wanted you to see how I work it out on paper and do it the first time, and it will feel more straightforward each time you do it. I'm gonna cut my 7 strips, sew them together with a bias seam, which means a diagonal seam to help reduce the bulk. Press each of those seams either open or to the side, and then press the entire thing in half. and my quilt binding is ready to go. Now I like to finish sewing the binding to my quilt by hand sewing with a needle and thread, which means I'm going to first machine sew it to the front of the quilt. And if you're lost in this step, go back to that Ultimate Quilt video. Start on the front side of the quilt, leaving a bit of a tail, using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sewing all those corners in that awesome way that I've shown you. Then you want to overlap the ends of the binding by 2.5 inches, which is the same width as our binding strips that we cut, 2.5 inches. Then flip the binding over to the back side of the quilt, and this is where I'm going to find a cozy spot to sit and hand sew everything in place because I really love this step. It's super relaxing. And here is our finished quilt. Congratulations, that was kind of a marathon. And you know what I really love about this quilt is that it's a little busier, I guess, than my typical aesthetic, but I'm really excited about that. I just want to sit on a chair or on the couch and be really cozy, and out of the corner of my eye see all these fun fabrics. Maybe that sounds kind of silly, but it sounds really kind of quaint and cozy. And with other holidays coming up, I'm kind of thinking of making a Christmas one with this cute fat quarter bundle from Art Gallery Fabrics. It's called Christmas in the Cabin. How perfect does that sound? And guess what? Comes with a flannel. Perfect for the bag. I have a lot of sewing to do, and you do too. So have fun with your 9 patch. Now that you understand how a 9 patch comes together, you're gonna find all sorts of ways to incorporate it into your own quilt designs, which is really fun and exciting. So for more sewing ideas, check out my website, madeeveryday.com. And for all of your sewing machines, go to babylock.com, where it's always for the love of sewing. Okay, bye. And don't get rid of all those backup pieces. Turn them into something fun. Okay, for reals. Bye.